Hey everybody, this is my experimental deep sandbed tank. I'm actually trying to see if we can get a denitrifying cycle going, and so far we have not, and we're going to talk about that a little in just a moment. But first we're going to do a water change. This is going to be a simple before and after video, and considering there's not going to be a whole lot of change between the before and after, we're just going to go ahead and give you a very quick before, and there's your after. So I'm going to put a little pinch of food in there, and then we're going to discuss what I've been finding with this experiment with the deep substrate. So first of all, this is all natural sand and gravel. I collected up from the same location basically as I collected the fish. Not the exact same location, but close enough. And that's where all that sand and gravel came from. So in theory, it may have had some denitrifying bacteria on it already, but in the process of bringing it home and rinsing it and mixing it around and putting it in the tank, I would have exposed it to a lot of oxygenated water, and that probably would have killed off any denitrifying bacteria that would have been in that deep sand in the stream where I collected it. The denitrifying bacteria needs anaerobic or non-oxygenated conditions. So me bringing it home and disturbing it and everything like that probably killed off any denitrifying bacteria. So the idea that I was going to have sort of a ready-to-go tank that was already going to have an established full nitrogen cycle where, you know, the denitrification happens as well, I didn't expect that. I expected it to take several months for the denitrification cycle to develop. It can take up to 6 months for that to happen, if it happens at all. There's still some debate as to whether this really can be established in a simple aquarium system like this. That's the whole purpose of me doing this. I believe it can, but I want to see for myself if it actually can. And the reason I know it's not doing that is because we're getting an accumulation of nitrates. I don't think anybody could really argue that this is a heavily stocked tank. It's a 10-gallon tank, and those little few gambusia, you can almost think about them as like wild guppies. They're mosquito fish, and they're closely related to guppies. That's it. That's the only animals that are in the tank. I don't really even have any pond or bladder snails or anything in there at this point, and I feed just a little pinch of food every day, and yet I know this is going to be kind of hard to tell under the circumstances, but that is what our nitrate has gotten up to. Or rather, I believe this one is what it had gotten up to, and then this is the after the water change. And again, I know it's really hard to tell here, but this is well over 40. This is in the red, and this is under 40. I'd call it about 30 parts per million after the water change. So, whoops, sorry about that. There you go. So the tanks I have in the other room, where I keep saying I'm getting this, I'm not getting a buildup of nitrate, and I don't know why. This is exactly the example of what I'm talking about, in that it's not a heavily stocked tank. I don't put a ton of food in there every day. It doesn't have leaf litter. It doesn't have stuff breaking down. And yet you just saw that the nitrates within a couple of weeks since my last water change, the nitrates, you know, they're up in the red. That's what you would expect to see. I'm not complaining about this. This is perfectly normal functioning for an aquarium, but it brings me back to, why do my other tanks that are much more heavily stocked than this and get fed much more heavily than this, what is it about those tanks that prevents the nitrate from ever developing? And I can't put my finger on exactly what it is, because all three of the tanks that I have that seem to be sort of nitrate resistant, I'll call them, all three of those tanks have separate and different qualities. They all have some that overlap, but there's no one quality that overlaps all three of those tanks that I could say, okay, well, this is the common factor. All three of these tanks have this in it, so let's see if this is what, So my best guess is sort of a deep sand bed or a denitrifying cycle that goes on in an anaerobic part. It doesn't necessarily have to be a super deep sand bed, but if it's an anaerobic part of the tank where the current is low enough and the water is basically moving through, and you can't even think of the water moving through that deep substrate as flowing water. It basically moves through there by the process of diffusion as the chemical compounds in it change and the water density changes as different minerals dissolve in or out of it or whatever. That's what causes the water to sort of move through. You can almost think about it as moving through there by like capillary action or like a wick effect, even though it's not technically moving through there by a wick effect, but it's moving through there with that kind of slowness. It's not flowing through that substrate. If it was flowing through that substrate, it would be carrying oxygenated water in there, and that's not good. It needs to be so deep down, and that water needs to be so slow moving that all the oxygen is gone by the time it gets down into that substrate, and that's where you'll get your denitrification happening. So if you've got an area in your tank that's covered by big flat rocks or has a big log lying on top of it, it may not necessarily be a deep section of substrate, but if it's a restricted section of substrate that allows for very, very poor water movement through it, it's possible that I could get some denitrification happening due to a scenario like that. Again, I'm not exactly sure what's going on in these three tanks. I've never really dealt with sort of a denitrification process up until very recently. I've kind of gotten curious about it. I've always just gone by the simple process of if you've got nitrate in your tank, just do a water change and it's done. Why go through all this hassle of setting your tank up? Just do a water change, you know? And so it's been interesting to see how this plays out. But so far, a couple of months in with this tank, and we're still accumulating nitrates at the rate you would expect nitrate to accumulate in a tank like this. So make sure you're subscribed, and that way you won't miss any of the updates on this tank or any of the other ones. We will get to the bottom of this, or at least to my standards. I'm not doing anything super scientific here. We're not taking any kind of controlled experiments or anything, just sort of tinkering in my fish room. But we're going to get to whatever kind of conclusions I can come to based on my little experiences. And if you're subscribed, you won't miss any of those. So thanks for watching, and I will see you real soon in the next one.